But welcome, Stefan, who is an old friend. In fact, we met at the United Nations when he was delegate, and over the years we kept in touch. Dr. Stefan Brupbacher went on to become the Director of Swissmem, the leading association for SMEs and large companies in Switzerland's mechanical and electrical engineering industries. From 2014 to 2018, he was the Secretary General of the Federal Department of Economic Affairs, Education and Research, WBF. Cosima and I have also known each other through CIFA, the Convention of Independent Financial Advisors, founded by my peer Jean-Pierre Lisserin. And she's very graciously accepted to moderate this panel. Thank you, Cosima. Cosima Barone is a seasoned wealth manager and financial analyst based in Geneva with over 4 decades of experience in the global financial industry. She's the founder and chairman of FINARC, Financial Analysis Research Consulting SA. So I just give the floor to Cosima. Thank you for being the moderator.
Thank you, Mariam. It's really a privilege for me to be interviewing Dr. Stefan Brupbacher, and I really thank you and Ms. Durbach for this invitation. I'm very privileged. And so you introduced already Dr. Brupbacher. I would like to make, before I give him the floor, I make a brief introduction about the topic, which is really a great topic to discuss today. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted how people live and how companies are run possibly forever, in my opinion. More than ever, the world has become aware that the future might look very different from today. And the 90 trillion world economy is experiencing its most severe collapse on record, a synchronized slowdown in 95% of the world economy. The damage already done has been quite substantial, although governments around the world, and less so in emerging countries, threat to provide cheap money with a downside not to ignore. Overall, global debt is expanding as a consequence. And unfortunately, while this liquidity is very important temporarily for households and industries, it may do very little to stimulate consumption and investment over the long run. So a V-shaped recovery might be off for quite a long time, I believe, but maybe Dr. Brupbacher will tell otherwise. Incidentally, we are witnessing that the global financial markets are more than ever disconnected from the real economy. What is happening in the US is a very good example. First, while the US output suffered a record decline in the second quarter, equaling some 500 billion in current dollar terms, the market value of domestic companies increased by 7 trillion. Second, at the same time, the stock market capitalization hit 2 times nominal GDP, eclipsing the previous record of 1.87 times at the peak of the dot-com bubble 20 years ago. In other words, the equity market today is the most expensive or overvalued in our lifetime. Undoubtedly, COVID has caused a synchronized dramatic collapse of demand and supply, with a rise in precautionary savings likely to continue and restraining global demand, since households remain worried about their incomes. At the same time, cautious spending on plant and equipment in particular, which also disrupts global supply chains altogether, are implying lower future productivity and economic growth. Global supply chains are the focus of our discussion today, and we are very pleased to listen to Dr. Brupbacher insights. The floor is yours, Stefan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I will try to get my slides up. They should now be up. And I would like to welcome everybody. I will try to give you in a first part a short introduction, what is the Swiss mechanical, metal and electronic engineering industry, then what are its challenges, how did we master so far over the past months the COVID crisis, and then specifically go to one challenge, and that is the threat for global supply chains. Let me start the Swiss MEM industry, as we call it, machinery, metal and electronic engineering industry. Our total turnover is close to 90 billion, of which we export 70 billion. That means an export rate of 80%, an export share. And this is 30% of all Swiss exports. 50% are pharmaceuticals, 10% watches, but 30% on the so-called MEM industry. And this already gives a clear indication that Switzerland is one of those countries which has not deindustrialized over the past 20 years. The GDP share of the industry is above 7%, and that is nearly double the share of Swiss banking, which is by far more famous than Swiss industry. We employ 325,000 employees in Switzerland. In addition, we employ 540,000 abroad. And this already gives a clear indication that our companies are highly integrated into global supply chains. In addition, we provide education through the apprenticeship system to 20,000 persons. 90% of our members are small and medium enterprises. And if we look at what are our members, then I give you just a very, very brief overlook to show you the huge variety of our structure and of our members. You have on the left upper side ABB, which is a household name everybody or most people know. But you have then also Bühler, which is a global leader for food processing machineries, which is active all over the world. You have Stadler, which is a train company which has become over the past 30 years to a competitor of global players such as Alstom and Siemens. But you have then further down a company like Thermoplan, which is the unique supplier of all Starbucks coffee machines out of Switzerland with 400 employees. And then you have the small companies like Gerber, and Gerber is in a way a very interesting case. With 25 people, they have an absolute monopoly for machines which are used and which are absolutely necessary in the production of gold coins. And hence, you have a company which is in the middle of nowhere in Switzerland, having its clients all gold coin producers worldwide. This to show you that there are a lot of global tech leaders in our membership, but these often niche players, and not nice players, they are not nice at all, but niche players, I'm sorry, they have carved out a niche where they are unique, but as I will come back to tell, they are fully integrated into global production chains. Now, we all know that there has always been the discussion about deindustrialization. In 2004, Switzerland's MEM industry employed, as you see on that slide, 310,000 persons. In 2008, we could discuss the reason for that increase. We employed 350,000, mainly also because the Swiss franc at that period was undervalued. And afterwards, you had the financial crisis, the euro crisis, when it dropped again. But in 2020, we again were at 325,000 employees. And this is the clearest, an absolute clear indication. A country such as Switzerland does not have to be deindustrialized with the right policy mix, despite the fact that, of course, China has been an incredible competitor. Now, when I said that we export 80%, let me show you where do we export our goods. You have on the left side of that slide the indication, or you have the table of our export countries. 60% of our exports go to the EU. That is including Great Britain, which is now, of course, in the new setting excluded, so we get to 55.6%. Asia is 18%, of which China is now close to 7%. And 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, we exported 10 times less to China than we do now. In various areas, China is currently the single dominant market, for example, textile industries. US is at 14%, and since the global financial crisis, the share of our exports to the US has increased by 50% in absolute terms, and in relative terms, even by 60%. If we look again at Europe, you see that we are hugely integrated with our neighbor countries, Germany, which takes a quarter of our exports, France and Italy as well, are 5 and 6. And these three countries together make more than a third of our exports. If you go now to the right column, you see what happened over the past 6 months. It means a historical slump of our exports, meaning to the EU minus 18%, to Asia minus 10%, and to the US minus 15%. Consider that this is in a period where we were not always in lockdown, but the US, for example, has been locked down for more or less 3 months, the EU also for 3 months. And hence the relevant data for the lockdown are even much worse. It also shows that, for example, France and Italy, over 6 months, we had minus 25% or minus 26%. And we really are in a historical slump of our exports. Now, if I mentioned that the EU is important, then you could even further look at the EU and see that the regions around Switzerland, so the German Länders, the regions in France, Italy, and Austria, they export 13.4 billion, whereas China and the US is the same amount. And more importantly, these markets, with the EU, we have a close intra- and intercompany networks within that we call Alpine Industrial Cluster, which is actually the core of Europe's industry. We have an exchange of production, R&D, and personnel. Whereas the US and China, we have much more access to growing markets. We have mainly sales and services. We increasingly in China have production because we want to be close to the market, and certain R&D activities. Research less because for IP reasons in China, development, however, even more and more. And the same with regard to the US is on production. There is production where necessary, but it's much more difficult to find suitable talent, even in the production lines in the US and, for example, in Asia. Now, what did we do over the past 6 months in a little bit more figures on the development? So you see, we had a slump or a decrease of exports in all of our main groups of products, mechanical engineering, metals, precious instruments. So it's all over where you look, it's negative. Now we had asked our members, what is the impact, what has been the impact of COVID-19? And you see that the worst impact was travel restrictions. Industry is an area where you cannot do business through Zoom or whatever telephone conferences. You need experts going to one place to the other. Our machinery often worth 10, 15 million Swiss francs or dollars or euro. There you have people necessary coming to Switzerland, take the machinery out of the country. So travel restrictions has been extremely hard. But of course, we had in 52% of the replies, we had supply chain disruptions. How important these supply chain disruptions were, you see that it then caused in 37% of the cases of Swiss companies of our membership a disruption of the production. That does not mean that the whole supply chain was disrupted and the whole production was disrupted, because indeed we hardly had any company which had to shut down totally for supply chain disruption. And interestingly, where was the supply chain disruption the worst? In China, it was for 2 months a disruption, but afterwards you could more or less get out everything again. Europe was much more harmful, and you had even, for example, in the case of Rail, the train construction company, you couldn't have the toilets anymore manufactured in Switzerland, and hence the trains couldn't be delivered. I tell that because we currently have a political discussion that we absolutely need more supply chains which are closer, for example, to Switzerland. We consider this nonsense, honestly, because history has now shown over the past 6 months that if you have the whole continent, Europe, being in a lockdown, it doesn't help at all if your supply chain is focused to Europe. And we consider one critical learning of the past 6 months is that you need several suppliers, that these suppliers have to be well prepared to accept and fulfill the relevant health conditions or health precautions. And you, of course, need more than one supplier. But I think the focus on one regional supplier, that is something mainly politicians wish for political reasons, but that is baseless with regards to what our companies think. You also see that on the far left, that for 19% of the companies responding to the survey, COVID-19 provided new chances. We asked then our membership in April, March, and in April, June, and July, what will be the impact on turnover of COVID-19? And you see that at the beginning, the first column is an indication less than 10% reduction of turnover. In the beginning, in April, one thought, or 25% of the companies felt it wouldn't be that bad and felt that you have less than 10% reduction of turnover. In July, 17% only felt it would be less than 10%. On the other hand, between 20 and 30% reduction, this number increased to 36%, and benefit in turnover or an increase in turnover in 2020, no company thought that would be possible in July, in the survey of July. So you see, the further the crisis went, the worse it became for our industry. And indeed, the worst we expect for the second, the third quarter. And this you will see on the next slide. When will the recovery take place? Again, April, June, and July. And at the beginning, 13% of the companies thought it would already start to recover in June. However, in July, you see that more than 50% of the companies feel that only in the course of 21 will the recovery take place. Why? Mainly because we are in the investment goods industry, very heavily engaged. And of course, if there are threats about the second wave, cars are not bought. And if nobody buys cars, there is no new machinery ordered to produce cars. And since this question of how do we respond to a second wave heavily weighs on the expectations when the recovery will take place. This has heavy financial repercussions. You see here EBIT 2018, 2019, and the estimates for 2020. And you see that even in a very good year like 2018, we had 12% of our companies, that is on the left column, which had a negative EBIT margin. 17 in 2019, and this spikes to 38% estimate for 2020. And together with an EBIT rate of 0 to 5%, which is not sustainable, you have more than 70% which expects such a negative or unsustainably low EBIT rate. Only 17% expect an EBIT rate of 8 to 15%, and this clearly shows that we have a sincere problem if COVID were to continue for too long. So what are the global challenges? And on the upper left, I put on a global scale the challenges for our industry, also our country. And the first 5 items are not linked to COVID-19. So it's first the cooling of the industry cycle, which started already in 2019. The re-emergence of protectionism and the tech and trade war between the US and China. The question about how does China develop as a market with the social credit system, which could be very painful for companies as well. Digitalization, which changes a lot of the products and business models. Climate change, which for our companies is more a chance than a threat. And then COVID, which most probably lasts for more than 2 years in our estimation. Then on the EU level, what is our biggest challenge is that we don't know whether the EU's new industrial policy with the promotion of European champions will not end in a huge threat for the backbone of European industry, and that is small and medium-sized industries. As Cosima has mentioned, there is a structural and financial imbalance in Europe, which eventually will lead to economic problems. And of course, you have in Europe, compared to the US or above all Asia, a rather dramatic lack of openness of society for new technologies. In the US, on the other hand, the current leader of the global rule-based system, you have a lack of leadership. And this is, of course, for a small country and export-oriented industry, a deadly threat if we were to lose the rule-based global trading system. Then, as a part of that, you have increasing local content requirements, and you have, especially in the US, a really difficult legal system, as I already mentioned, lack of skilled people. And with regard to the legal system with punitive damages, huge amount, the rather costly legal system with regard to lawyers, etc. This is a hindrance for companies being active in the US. Then in Switzerland, you have, of course, all the external threats, which are a threat to Swiss small and medium enterprises. We have a particular problem in Switzerland, the market access of the Swiss economy, EU. And then you have, of course, national resistances vis-à-vis globalization and the EU as well, because we are not better or different people than any other. Now, these are our issues. Let me now particularly dwell for the last 5 minutes on something which we think is historically a parallel to the beginning of the last century, and which really concerns us a lot, because if we were to follow the same pattern as in the last century, we would end up in real big trouble. So there are economically historical trends between 1870 and 1913, where you had, for example, the US becoming a global manufacturing power. However, the US had already at that period a huge isolationist policy, and it had anyway its big market, whereas the second, and on this slide, the third power was a late industrializing power. Germany and Japan, they desperately needed market access. And of course, we know, historians know that this market access at that moment was more or less considered having colonies, having access to colonies. And of course, both Germany and Japan didn't get access to colonies for the right reasons, of course. But this in turn led in these countries to a rise of nationalism and militarism. Now, if we look at China today, we have up to a certain extent a similar development, with China a late industrializing country, today with a huge share of global GDP and of course also global manufacturing output. Normally we would argue that the thing which now has to happen is to integrate China as good as possible into the global trading system, asking for level playing field in a very clear, strong way, but of course not to dismantle the global trading system. Because when that happened over the past 100 years, you see that here, this is the up and downs of world trade. You see that during World War I and World War II, there are no data. But above all, you see in the middle that decrease of global world trade, that is the Smooth-Haley Tariff Act and other protectionist measures, which really brought globalization to a standstill at that moment. We consider that the past 60 years since we have the rule-based modern system should show why globalization has been beneficial for everybody, as this slide, and of course, I should also mention that these slides were copied from the Financial Times, that globalization brought a reduction of global inequality, overall inequality, but above all, inter-country inequality has incredibly decreased. Intra-country inequality has increased, slightly increased, but this, the second thing, is main or above all a question of national policies. In the case of Switzerland, you can see that the Gini coefficient has not increased over the past 30 years. And if you see here in the red line, which is labor compensation, has been always higher than the yellow line, which is GDP development. And this has also been higher, especially since the financial crisis, than the blue line, which is the compensation capital gets. This is a clear proof that at least in a country such as Switzerland, labor has received over the past 10 years a bigger share of the pie, of the growing pie. And the pie has been growing because we have exports, because we have globalization. Now, it is not only for Switzerland the case, but you see here, this is the reduction of absolute poverty as share of the total population according to different regions. I'm sorry that I couldn't make a translation on that, but you see that especially in Asia, dramatic fall of poverty from 80% to below 10%. So we consider that globalization over the past 40 years has been the best poverty reduction program. Now, what is the problem and why do I expand so long on that? The reason is that we have a total lack of factfulness, because in surveys, when people are asked, has absolute poverty increased over the past 20 years? In France, 70% say yes, it has. In Germany, it's 63%. In the US, it's 51%. In Britain, it's still 40%. And we feel that if we don't change this misinformation, we are up for a further trend against globalization. And for the MEM industry and small and open economies, such as Switzerland, this would be disastrous. This would not only for Switzerland as a small economy be disastrous, but since small and open economies have been the most innovative and the most successful countries, I think this would have wider repercussions. Let me conclude on the following. The MEM industry is key, and we can discuss that in our discussion. The MEM industry is key to find solution from COVID-19 to climate change. Because why do I say it COVID-19? Because if you eventually have a vaccine, you have to produce the vaccine, and production of vaccine only is only possible if you have the relevant machinery. And for example, some of our industries, some of our members, which on the second slide you found, Micron, they produce such machinery. Up to climate change, because new ways of mobility, new ways of electric storage or energy storage, for example, that is developed by our industry. Secondly, the industry has been globally integrated. This has resulted in innovation, above all, falling prices for goods and services, and a poverty reduction. And Switzerland shows developed nations don't have to be at all afraid of China. What we have to be afraid of, however, is a re-emergence of protectionism and industrial policy, such as in the EU, which focuses on the support of big global European leaders, because that would be the end of the small and medium enterprises. And both protectionism and industrial policy would be a danger for global stability and prosperity, both in developed and developing countries. I think if you want a final quote, Montesquieu, whom we all know more for governance reason, has one famous quote, which is less quoted than others. He said 250 years ago that trade brings peace and wealth. And we should have seen in the past 40 years that this has been true. And I think the current situation, even in COVID, has clearly shown that, since our industries were able, thanks to being globally integrated, to provide, for example, ventilators which were exported from Hamilton, that is one of the companies, to the US. And I think we should both learn from the past 6 months, but also from the past 40 years, and definitely not make the mistakes of the beginning of the past century. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I have been provocative enough to have some questions and a nice discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. Really, it was an interesting presentation, and you covered a very large topic and overall the industry and also the globe. Very insightful. I remember you mentioned the relationship between Switzerland and China, and I remember that Minister of Economy, Schneider Hamann of NAP, that road to Switzerland, right? It was a great opportunity because it was so knowledgeable about China, and it has been really good for Switzerland. So if you allow me, I prepared some questions, and we can start with the first one, which is related to trade. The modern trade architecture is relatively young since the WTO, even though GATT was, set up after war, but the WTO has been set up in the 90s at the end of Cold War. And while it is resilient, the recent political shocks and the impact of natural factors such as tsunamis and COVID viruses, etc., are highlighting its important vulnerabilities. So you mentioned the importance of trade, global trade, but for instance, the multilateral trade agreement have grown extremely complex and minimally flexible, and also trade disputes can take years to resolve within WTO. How global trade patterns might be shifting in your opinion?
Well, thank you for that question, because I think global trade patterns might well shift in a way that they become more regional, not for trade reason, but mainly for technology reason. This is technology war between the US and China. Huawei is one of the examples. And during the period when I was Secretary General of the Ministry of Economic Affairs for 5 years, I had the relevant information, and I never ever saw any hint that this company should be or could be a threat for Switzerland. That is one of the reasons why Huawei is still very much able to provide the technology in Switzerland for 5G. Now, of course, there could be regionalization. That would be bad because it would increase cost. And who pays it? It's always the consumer who pays it. You have one beautiful example of protectionism during the Obama administration, where the Obama administration protected the tire industry, and for every single protected job, consumers had to pay 10 times more than the salary of the protected job. And that is just economic nonsense. However, when you talk about the WTO, I fully agree that the WTO needs reform. And interestingly, the Trump administration should be viewed on two different levels. Mr. Trump himself, he apparently can't care less about the WTO and attacks it constantly. On an administrative level, however, you have concrete proposals, not only on the reform of the dispute settlement mechanism, but also on how to limit subsidies. And there are proposals which, for example, according to the Financial Times today, the candidates for succeeding the Director General of the WTO, the main candidates, they agree that the US definitely have a point on that. That is the first point, that there is indeed a certain that you can reform the WTO, and there is a historical parallel to that. You remember the Reagan administration being totally against Japan, and if you read economic textbooks of the 90s, you just can replace China and Japan and you have the same argument. 4 years later, the Bush administration and the Clinton administration led the way to the establishment of the WTO. And I think that one positive narrative would be that after a certain clash, we would finally get our grips together, get our act together and reform the WTO, because we now know how important it is that we trade among nations.
Thank you. I saw also that article in the Financial Times today, and it's really, it inspires some positive thoughts for the reformation of the WTO. My second question is, the world has grown over-dependent on a global supply chain for all sorts of products, as well as in recent months for medicine, medical supplies, medical equipment, a situation that has revived self-sufficiency desires with a protectionist-minded nations. Is COVID-19 shaking the very fundamentals of modern globalization and multilateralism in your view? Sorry. I mean, you touched on your presentation, but maybe you would like to be...
Yeah, well, of course, it is shaking it, but it is not, it is shaking it for the wrong reason. It is shaking it because protectionist politicians who want to get protectionism in order to be elected, because by doing so, they can get the votes. They abuse COVID, would be my provocative statement, to get the votes and to be elected. Let me show you that on one example. Switzerland did not have enough masks. Okay, we had a plan to store everything in our mountains, in our hospitals, whatever. The cantons didn't do it, so we didn't have enough masks. Now, should we now have an own mask production? That would be nonsense, because the fiber you use for the production of masks, we don't produce it in Switzerland, it's produced in Germany or India. So you never ever can be fully sovereign or fully self-sufficient. Moreover, in the case of Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU, we have so many companies which are critical or which produce critical parts or final products for hospitals that no other country wanted to threaten our companies and the delivery of medical goods to Switzerland. Because had they blocked the delivery of goods to Switzerland, then the Swiss could have blocked it to other countries. So we have in virtually every area, from ventilators to intensive care, other intensive care units, to pharmaceuticals, we have companies which are key in the global supply chain. And I think if every country were to try to move in the same direction, to be as highly integrated in the global supply chain, then that would be the best defense against being shut off in such a crisis. Now let me just say one more point. If you talk about self-sufficiency and reorganizing global supply chains, this is a discussion mainly carried out by politicians who have no clue whatsoever what a supply chain means and what a supply chain is. Let's take medical supplies, airplanes or cars. These are supply chains where you need parts which have been certified, which need long established contracts, and you just cannot disrupt these supply chains overnight because politicians do please so. Because otherwise you would lose certification, and you don't want to have an airplane falling from the sky because you use the wrong screws. And hence the whole discussion is very dangerous, very uneconomic, and unfortunately lacks understanding what a supply chain is.
So thank you. I think it's a blessing to have an independent industry and very comprehensive politicians in Switzerland. So yeah, I think you just explained how the cross-border supply chains could be revised. It's, you know, use the example of Switzerland, actually. Another question, are the shifting global trade patterns driven more by social and political factors, changing technology, or economics? Which one of those 4 or 5, in your opinion?
Well, I think all. You could have arguments for all. You can take technology, for example, 3D printing or advanced manufacturing. You nowadays have textile spinning machines which can produce a running shoe, a Nike running shoe, on a single machine with a single thread. So spinning machine thread produces a running shoe. Mm-hmm. The machine, of course, enables you to produce running shoes no longer in Asia, but for example in France, Switzerland, wherever you want. This, however, only if it's economically feasible. And this goes back to the point, in the end, our consumers greatly benefited over the past 20 years from global production chains because we had a reduction of consumer goods, of the price of consumer goods on average of more than 1 to 2% per year. And I think our consumers, especially the middle class, is not willing to suddenly pay 10–20% more for running shoes because they are produced in France, Switzerland, or wherever. So there are technological avenues which allow production to be reshored, but it has to remain economical. And I think I already explained that I'm really sorry about the fact that the fear, the angst of big parts of the population losing jobs is abused by politicians for protectionist measures with the goal to change trade patterns. So it's social reasons being abused by politicians, which might lead to the change of trade patterns. And of course, then you have the question of primacy in technology. That is the question of who am I, which I mentioned before. But on all these areas, for example, the fear of jobs, educate your people, make apprenticeship system, have a social security network, have re-education. That is a much better and much cheaper way of dealing with the fear than protectionism.
Absolutely, I agree with you. In your opinion, are there any political incentives or technological adaptation that you can see the supply chains shorten and manufacturing location shift, for example, because self-sufficiency, it means that, you know, manufacturing should be relocated into a nation or into a country. Do you see any help on this thing? And could there be any future trade agreements less encompassing and more readily revised, in your opinion, to enhance this the supply chain globally?
Well, you have already prior to COVID, you had, for example, in the new agreement between Mexico, the US and Canada, you had an increase of local content regulation. So that meant that more of the goods needed a local content or a higher local content in one of these three countries if they wanted to benefit from the successor agreement of NAFTA. But again, this tends to lead to higher cost, and it tends to lead to a disintegration of global trade pattern. And we in general do not have an interest that, for example, China becomes too self-sufficient on its market as well, because as long as China is depending on our markets, we have a trump card to push China to become compliant with global trade rules as well. Because I don't want to be misunderstood that China is a nice guy. They shouldn't be considered, for example, a developing country under the WTO rules. And we have to force them to accept that they no longer are a developing country under the WTO rules, and then the rules become much more stricter for them. But for doing so, we need them to continue to be fully integrated in the global system, and therefore the whole discussion about shortening supply chains, regionalization is dangerous. Geopolitically, in our opinion, in my personal opinion, it is dangerous. And political incentives, of course, there are. The EU will have billions of dollars as political and financial incentives to bring back production. Japan as well has billions of yen. Well, the currency is, the denomination is even a little bit different, which should allow them to bring back their production. But economically, that doesn't make sense. In the long run, it won't make sense to have such a policy.
Yeah, you mentioned China. Actually, they missed a very important deadline to change their status within WTO. I think it was June 15, right?
Yeah.
And they missed the deadline. So it's their fault. Okay, let's go to the next questions. COVID-19 represents a big challenge for countries that have been engaged in larger scale port developments over the past decade, particularly along the China Belt and Road Initiative, but especially for businesses due to the global collapse of supply chains that you told us in your presentation and the resulting reduced predictability for their activity. How are businesses in Switzerland coping with the global collapse of supply chains and the drastically reduced predictability of their activity, in your opinion?
I think if entrepreneurs hate one thing, then it's a lack of predictability. And hence you are totally correct that each and every company is reviewing its supply chain. But it's not reviewing it in the way to shorten it. Because as I mentioned, Stadler Rail, the train company, had a problem with a supplier in Switzerland, but you test whether your suppliers whether you not only need one supplier, but more often 2 or 3 suppliers. And honestly, in the industry, most companies have more than one supplier already. Then you do checks how many of the goods you have in store. So it's above all a change of just-in-time supply chains. You need more storage facilities. And then you need more information gathering, and you need models on the predictability of second waves, for example. But as I mentioned, in certain areas, airplanes, cars, medical goods, change of suppliers takes months to years, and these supply chains had been established over a couple of years, 10 years, 15 years, and you just can't change that so easily. I think my call would be leave it to the companies, because that's their specialty. Leave it to the companies, allow them to make their job, and they shall be responsible to make sure that their supply chain works. What my recommendation for the Swiss government would be is that we in Switzerland have an additional unique selling proposition, meaning that since the industry has shown that we can implement all health requirements and that we did not have any significant outbreak in any of our companies, we should make sure, and we should have propaganda or information activities that companies in Switzerland will stay open and will be able to deliver at whatever the situation is. And this would be a USP. And if we were able to make a competition of countries with similar approaches, I think then the government would do something really good, because all scientific research has shown that it's not the companies in the supply chain which have been the main problem for the outbreak, at least in developed countries, developing countries where migrant workers are living together in narrow areas, in rooms 6 to 10 person together. It's of course a totally different case, and I don't want to mix the two things. Now, you also mentioned the China Belt and Road Initiative. I think in the long run, it will nevertheless be very much important for these countries to have this infrastructure. So I think in the mid-run, infrastructure has been an advantage. It will remain an advantage, but they might have to renegotiate terms with their with their financiers when they built the Belt and Road infrastructure.
Thank you. So let's go to a more touchy subject. You probably saw that in Germany, 2 ministers are proposing a due diligence law for supply chains, which is causing a large and fierce debate about how to meet human rights and fair competition standards in a globalized world. So the needed due diligence required by such a law would, of course, weigh more on small and medium enterprises than on large companies. In your opinion, do global business practices, in your view, need such a law at all, or also applying to every location where they do business? And how disruptive to business growth would such a law be? And also, has Switzerland ever considered legislating on supply chains? Let us have your views on that.
But since Cosima, you are Swiss, you know that we even will vote about exactly such a law.
I would not vote no.
Since in Switzerland we have the instrument of public initiatives. 100,000 Swiss can sign a proposal, then it goes to Parliament, they might make a counter proposal, and eventually it is tabled to the people. And indeed, a couple of years ago, a group of NGOs, churches, political parties launched such an initiative requiring internationally active companies that wherever they are globally to respect local and international human rights standards and Swiss standards, in Switzerland accepted human rights standards, I should say. And above all, and that's the critical point, you could become liable for damages and you could be brought to the tribunal in Switzerland. And in the tribunal in Switzerland, you would have to prove, you as a company would have to prove that your innocence. Now, something like that is the death knell for a location like Switzerland, because all companies would move away. And why? Because you do not want to give NGOs the possibility to draw you to the court and to be in the media negatively. So you get hijacked by a campaign of NGOs, and you no longer have the right and the fair chance in a fair tribunal. Because companies, honestly, they don't want to have the reputational cost of 2-3 years until a court has decided whether they met the standards or not. So I think something like that is impossible. Now, on the other side, we already have a huge number of obligations which have to be accepted. And I'm absolutely sure that our companies, in their subsidiaries abroad, they respect the international standards because already they need excellent workforce. That is number one. Number two, public pressure can help. I agree. We all know the case of Nike 20 years ago and organizations such as the Fair Labor Association, which has increased and improved radically the labor standards, for example, in the garment sector. But I would much more emphasize on technical solutions which can show, which can enable the consumer that whatever he buys is really something well produced. And then the consumer can show that he is really concerned and considers to pay more. And let me elaborate in one phrase on that. We have in so-called photonics new ways to identify, for example, whether a tuna has been line fished in Indonesia or not. And then together with blockchain, you can prove that the same part of that tuna is indeed the thing you buy in Migros or wherever in the Carrefour has been line fished or was line fished. And I think these methods are much better than if you have such harsh laws, which are mainly something excellent for public campaigns, but will not lead to a change. Because honestly, that will only lead that companies in countries such as China, which are not linked to the same standards, will benefit more.
Yeah. We are almost done, but if we can, I can ask you one more question. That's really a touchy subject, and it regards our relations of Switzerland with the EU. Last March, the EU issued a white paper on leveling the playing field as regards foreign subsidies. Since trade accounts for almost 35% of the EU's GDPs, 35 million European jobs are linked to export, and the EU is the world's main provider and top global destination of foreign direct investments, FDIs. the European Union issued in this white paper a model called Open Strategic Autonomy, whatever that means. But they explain this as saying a new system of global economic governance where mutually beneficial bilateral relations are developed. Essentially, the EU is proposing to limit foreign investments by controlling state subsidies. Would this be a viable option for Switzerland, in your opinion?
3 points. Economically, a subsidy is a gift of the taxpayer in country A to the consumer in country B. So if the French government subsidizes its farmers and farm prices of French beef are much lower, as Swiss consumer, I should be happy about the gift of the French taxpayer. But of course, politically, this is a non-viable economic point of view. And therefore, I think you really draw on a very important question. However, then I should say the following 2 points. I think it is crucial to have subsidies being limited and curtailed, especially also with regard to China. The EU, together with Japan and the US, has tabled proposals on the limitation of acceptable subsidies in December or January at the WTO Working Party. And these subsidies, for example, would be prohibited for companies with no clear business plan and no clear plan for continuing to stand alone. So if, for example, now we see that Alitalia has no chance to survive, subsidies would no longer be acceptable. And by using the case of Alitalia, I come to my second point. It shows that the EU is a huge user of subsidies. So it's not actually only the Chinese who use subsidies. After the financial crisis, you had most banks in Europe being partly state-owned. You have Volkswagen, the biggest, one of the biggest global car industries, which has a shareholder called some of the German lenders.
Yes.
You have now a huge package being drawn by the European Union, which might end up partly as subsidies. So my point is, yes, we absolutely have to curtail subsidies because very often it's a waste of taxpayers' money for vested interests. And that is beneficial for everybody, especially the masses of the people. But we have to be aware that it's not only China who cheats, it's above all also, and unfortunately increasingly, Europe, but also Switzerland with its farm policy, and of course other countries as well. So it's a critical point we have to solve, and I would hope that the excellent proposal made by the administrations, not the political level, but the administration of the US, the European Union and Japan prior to the COVID crisis were to be taken up, were to become law, and that this would lead to all our countries wasting less money on useless subsidies.
Yeah, that's a very good conclusion, I would say. And thank you very much. It's been really a pleasure and a privilege for your moderating this interview, and also thank you for your insightful views that I'm sure will be listened also by not only the audience present today, but also by the other viewers as an example of what Switzerland does very well. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Dr. Brupbacher, and thank you all. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you all for your attention and all the best. Thank you, Cosima.
Thank you, Stefan.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. WIT, it was a pleasure.